Hello then, welcome back to day 4 of Contact in the Desert. It's me, Gunnar, for heaventoearth.com. I'm joined by a very special friend, Mr. Robert Schoch. Good afternoon, how are you?
Yes, good afternoon. It's good to be here. Good to see you.
Good. Now, Robert Schoch, of course, you trained at Yale, I believe, as a geologist and a geophysicist.
That's where I received my PhD, correct?
That's right. And then you went on in the 1990s to do something that kind of shocked the world. Tell us about that.
Well, what I'm really best known for, I suppose, is my redating of the Great Sphinx.
Yes.
I went to Egypt first in 1990, literally 1990, and I was brought there by John Anthony West, good friend and colleague, and he invited me to come to Egypt with him, my first time to Egypt, and the purpose was for me to look at the Great Sphinx from a geological point of view.
Okay.
Now, this was to set the stage. In 1990, the Egyptological dogma, which I hate to say still is the Egyptological dogma, is that the Sphinx was carved de novo from scratch in 2500 BC. I went there thinking, obviously the Egyptologists, they know what they're talking about. I wasn't going to find anything different, despite the fact that John Anthony West said, oh, you know, it looks like excuse me, it looks like there may be some anomalies, there may be something amiss here. So I went, but I was incredibly skeptical, and I figured, and I don't want to sound the wrong way, I figured, you know, I'll go over there, I'll show him, John Anthony West, why he's wrong, why the Egyptologists are right, and I'll get to go to Egypt for free.
That sounds good.
Because he actually, you know, had arranged funding for this. So I had nothing to lose other than a little bit of time, and, you know, go to Egypt, you know. We didn't worry about terrorism and that so much back then, I suppose, that I wasn't thinking about. So I went to Egypt, and lo and behold, I get there. I see the Sphinx for the first time, and within minutes, I realize there is a problem here. Because when you look at the Sphinx from a geological point of view, and you look at the body, you look at the what's known as the Sphinx enclosure, because the Sphinx is carved out of the bedrock. Only the head sits above the level of the general ground there. They had to carve down into the bedrock, and they carved out huge blocks weighing tens of tons and moved them east and erected what's known as the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temples. So you've got the body of the Sphinx, you've got the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. I'm looking at them, and they show the signs, the telltale signs of weathering and erosion by water.
By water, and so now, not by sand,
not
by wind?
Not by sand, not by wind. And here we are on the edge of the Sahara Desert, hyper-arid for the last 5,000 years. So what is going on? So that was the first clue that there is something amiss here. And immediately it came to me, and I was thinking about this, that the Sphinx, the oldest portions of the Sphinx, must go back to a different climatic regime.
Absolutely.
Pre-Sahara. And I also noticed right away, very, very quickly, within the first few minutes, that the head of the Sphinx, in my assessment, especially when you look from the side, is too small for the body. And why? It's a dynastic head. And I have no doubt to this day that it is not the original head on the Sphinx, that the original head was heavily weathered and eroded, and therefore, instead of repairing it, because it's very hard to repair something like that, they just carved it down, and it's a smaller head. I suspect the Sphinx was not a Sphinx originally. I suspect it was a lion.
Yeah.
And now, as I pursued this, and that was 1990, so I've been doing this now for over a quarter century. I've been going back and forth to Egypt numerous times, carrying out all kinds of complex studies, and really building the case. You know, I talk about this in my book, Forgotten Civilization. I talk about this also with a book that Robert Bouval and I just put together, Origins of the Sphinx. But really, for the big picture, I suggest Forgotten Civilization. I just say that as a general comment. And what we really are looking at, and there are implications here, is that the Sphinx is sort of the proverbial tip of the iceberg, that there was a civilization, what I call cycle of civilization, going back to remote times, going back to the end of the last ice age, prior to 9,700 BC, the core body of the Sphinx, like I said, the head has been recarved, but the core body of the Sphinx goes back to that earlier period. Looking at Egypt in particular, it was a different climatic regime. Furthermore, the Sphinx suffered the cataclysms at the end of the last ice age, or what I'll call the proto-Sphinx. And something that we had was an incredible change in temperature, cataclysmic change in temperature, literally virtually overnight, a warming, a melting of glaciers. This actually all has to do with solar outbursts, not to get too complex too quickly. And when you melt all these glaciers so quickly from major solar outbursts that hit the Earth with what we call plasma discharges, among other things, you put incredible amounts of moisture into the atmosphere. Now what happens to that can only hold so much moisture, it comes down as rain. What's the Sphinx weathered by?
Exactly,
It's
water.
incredible water and rains and torrential, there would have been torrential flooding.
And that's how it looks, isn't it?
And that's how it looks. I mean, so it all starts to fit together. I mean, I'm really simplifying things at the moment. I want to say we carried out, for instance, seismic studies around the Sphinx, so I could look at subsurface mineralogical changes and calibrate that. So it's a lot more than just the weathering on the Sphinx. I want to make that clear.
Yeah, there's a whole picture
There's
surrounding
a whole
this.
picture surrounding it. But I feel more comfortable now, more confident now with all the evidence we have on my dating of the Sphinx than I ever have. And I put it back to roughly 10,000 BC before the end of the last ice age. Again, that proto-Sphinx. I just want to stress the head has been recarved.
Did you expect to find anything like this when you went to see the Sphinx? I mean, you're a geologist by trade. I'm guessing most people probably don't come to these conclusions. It must have been quite an epiphany for you when you kind of got there and went, oh my God.
Yeah, it was.
This isn't what we're told.
It was. Now, I did not express that publicly because I'm a scientist and I try to be very careful.
Just take the data in first.
Actually, John Anthony West would often tell the story in later years how it was so difficult for me to get me to say anything definitive because he wanted to make a movie about this. He wanted to go to the newspapers and right away, you know, with these revelations. And I kept being very quiet and reticent, and I didn't want to discuss this publicly because I said we have to put all our, as they say, ducks in the row. We have to get all our evidence together. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something. Was I making some really stupid mistake? Because honestly, I was saying to myself, how could the Egyptologists be so wrong?
Yeah.
How could they have missed this? What is going on here? As it turns out, and I can only say this in hindsight, Egyptologists, and no disrespect to them necessarily, but they're not geologists. They're not necessarily scientists. In fact, it's not really a science. And I don't say that disrespectfully.
Yeah, but you're right, but analogy would refer to a science or a piece of learning, wouldn't it? A body of learning.
Yeah, it's a body of learning. And Egyptology is very different. And Egyptologists don't have the perspective that a geologist has. And they are looking at different types of evidence, different type of data, none of which I deny. This is the interesting thing because all the Egyptological data fits right in with what I'm talking about. It's just that the ancient Egyptians in Old Kingdom dynastic times did not carve the Sphinx. They refurbished the Sphinx. They recarved parts of it. They added blocks, and you can see those to this day, around the paws, around the rump, to restore the original outline. But they didn't carve it from scratch.
Now, you said yourself as well, and it's so obvious when you look at the Sphinx, particularly from the side, the body, the head, is so much smaller than it should be.
Exactly. Oh, it's out of proportion, and this is something that I noticed right away. It sort of, I don't want to say it troubled me, because it didn't trouble me at all, but it was interesting because people had actually warned me before I went to Egypt for the first time. They said, you're going to be blown away. It's like you're going to have these, you might go into a trance or something. And, I take all that type of thing seriously. I'm interested in paranormal phenomena and psychic phenomena. But there's also a lot of nonsense out there.
Yes.
And you have to sort that out.
That's the hard bit.
You really have to get rid of that out. So, I didn't dismiss that. But it was interesting going there because I was in my scientist geology strict mode. yeah, one of the things I say right away is that head is too small for the
Way
body.
too small.
It's the greatest statue on earth,
And the head's
it's
this
out of
big.
proportion. Yeah. But it all makes sense. It adds to, I think, the importance of the statue. And the fact is, I believe that, based on the evidence, that what we have is something that for the dynastic Egyptians 4,500 years ago, 2,500 BC, to them was very, very ancient. I mean, it actually, the dating of the Sphinx that I'm advocating based on the evidence, the distance in time between the ancient Egyptians in the 4th dynasty and the original Sphinx is greater than from the 4th dynasty up to the present.
Wow.
You see what I mean?
And that really puts it into perspective.
Yeah, because they're 4,500 years ago. We're talking 12,000 years ago for the Sphinx, so more than twice as old. So for them, it was a very ancient, sacred relic. I believe that they were doing their best to restore, to venerate. They built a complex around this structure, so that's why you have a lot of ancient dynastic. And they're clearly ancient dynastic, from the Old Kingdom or New Kingdom times, even late period, even Greco-Roman times, because this was a very sacred site. But the core of that site was what we call the Sphinx. Like I said, it may have been a lion. In fact, in the age of Leo, the Sphinx sits due east. In the age of Leo, on the vernal equinox, it was facing Leo. Again, this is one of the many reasons I suspect it was originally a lion, not a sphinx with a human head.
And then you think, like I say, over the years, people have kind of whittled it down and
They've
changed the shape
whittled it down,
of it, put it
they've
into their own
changed
image.
shape. I mean, it may have gone through more than one iteration, more than one head, because the head is relatively small. It's a huge head still.
Yeah, it is.
But it's small relative to the body. So it may have been a lion at one point. It's obviously a human at this point, dynastic with a dynastic headdress. Who knows if there was some intermediate stage.
So would you think then that the pyramids of Giza were also built around the same time? And the way it looks to me is a lot of the dynasties that follow on from that seem to try to replicate what happened with the Great Pyramids of Giza.
Yeah.
But not exactly. They weren't able to use the technology.
Something that's very interesting, and I take people to Egypt. I do tours to Egypt, as did John Anthony West. And this ties in with it, so I'm not ignoring your question. And I take people throughout Egypt, and we look at pyramids. And it's very interesting, this is exactly what you're pointing out, that the greatest pyramid, in many ways, is the Great Pyramid. And that's not the oldest absolute pyramid from an Egyptological perspective, but it is very old. Even the Egyptologists admit that, relative to other pyramids. So you have the Old Kingdom pyramids, which are incredible, and particularly the Great Pyramid. Then as you go into later pyramids, going into the Middle Kingdom, etc., they go downhill.
Yeah.
I mean, the construction techniques are just not the same.
Much more step pyramids, much more rough around the edges,
much
not with the
more
limestone
rough,
finish.
etc. Now you got to be careful, because the step pyramid Saqqara is, according to Egyptologists, older than the Great Pyramid, and it's not at the level of the Great Pyramid, but it's still an incredible pyramid compared to pyramids hundreds, centuries, even millennia, well, not millennia, but centuries later in the Middle Kingdom. So there is a general decline, and much of Egyptian art is really at its peak, most people would say, at the very beginning. So you have this, I hate to use the term decline, because I respect all of ancient Egypt, and there are other very good aspects of even late period Egypt. But you do have that trend, which is interesting. Now, as far as the dating of the Great Pyramid or the second and third pyramid on the Giza Plateau, without going into great detail, I am convinced that the sites of those pyramids are very ancient. So the Great Pyramid itself is built over a sacred mound, what I call a sacred mound. And this is acknowledged by the Egyptologists, that under it is a mound. And when I say mound, we're talking bedrock. The descending passage in the subterranean chamber, I have no doubt, go back much earlier than Old Kingdom times.
Wow.
So maybe back to Sphinx times. The second pyramid also has a base that goes back earlier, as far as the evidence indicates to me. Associated with the second pyramid is what's now known as a mortuary temple, but in fact that's a two-stage construction, the oldest portion of which is huge megalithic blocks, goes back, in my opinion, to that earlier period. So you have all these other signs on the Giza Plateau. The Great Pyramid itself, certainly the core goes back to the earlier period, but I also believe that the dynastic Egyptians may have been adding to it, may have been doing things. So this is a complex,
very complex
issue.
It's easy to see how we've got it tied up over the years.
Exactly. But it ties in with the evidence, and there's other evidence. My colleague Robert Bouval is of course famous for the Orion correlation theory and tying the three major pyramids as representatives, should we say, of Orion's belt in the sky, but it only all aligns up correctly.
Yeah, which is amazing.
And about 10,500 BC, he and I write about this in our joint book, and this aligns with my geological dating. So again, the bottom line is that even though Egyptologists can argue and find inscriptions from the New Kingdom or whatever, or even Old Kingdom, and say, yes, the Old Kingdom people were there, the New Kingdom people were there. Yeah, of course they were there. And of course they were using this. But that's the same as, I love Istanbul. Not changing subjects too much, but you have the great monuments in Istanbul, or Rome. The Colosseum, everyone knows that. So any ancient city like that, 10,000 years from now, if they go and they excavate one of these sites that we know is thousands of years old, and they find, coins from 2017, are they going to 2017?
That's a very good point, isn't it?
Yeah, they'll be wrong.
Very good point.
I mean, of course, but the origins go back much earlier. So that's my point. That's my point.
So as a geologist then, you're a scientist, and you mentioned before about not going and rushing into this and going too public. I'm guessing as a scientist you let the data fall where it falls, ultimately.
Oh, I absolutely let it fall where it falls. My credo, the way I operate, is I look at the evidence. I try my absolute best to always be objective, look at the evidence and solid evidence, and not dismiss any of the evidence, and wherever the evidence leads, that's where I go. And this has gotten me in trouble on both sides, because the evidence has indicated to me that the Sphinx is older, for instance, and many of my academic colleagues, especially the archaeologists, Egyptologists, have not liked that. Now I have to say that my geological colleagues, when I presented this at Geological Society of America, for instance, or other contact, the geologists have agreed with me. I mean, they think it's fine. But the thing is, they don't have a vested interest in the age of the Sphinx. What do they care either way? They can follow the evidence without having their own egos, vested interests, and careers involved. And I have that to a certain extent too, because I'm not a PhD Egyptologist. Although on the other hand, I've learned quite a bit of Egyptology, and I try to be very, very well-rounded. But yeah, I try to follow the evidence, and if something came out tomorrow that disproved everything I've been talking about, I want to be strong enough to say, okay, I made a mistake.
And that's good.
Yeah.
Because there are so many people who are dogmatic about this stuff, who refuse to budge and say my idea is right.
Yeah,
but I guess as a scientist, that's absolutely important, isn't it?
It's very
if the
important.
data changes, then you I guess you create a new theory, and then you start to...
and then you move on. Now, psychologically, it's very difficult, and sociologically...
surely that's only ego, though, isn't it?
Yeah,
if you refuse to let go.
It has to do with people's egos, and I've seen this in the sciences and other fields too, where people will not let go of their pet theories, not let go of even though evidence starts coming in, just demonstrating it's wrong. And even if they won prizes for their great scientific achievements, and then it turns out that's not quite right, or just a piece of the story. And many times in sciences, we like to at least put it in the context, well, okay, he was still a great scientist, or she was still a great scientist, even if, in fact, in hindsight, the theories are not quite correct, because they were working with what they had at the time, and that's fine. And we have to move on as the evidence dictates.
Okay, so you mentioned that you took this to other geologists and you showed this information. I heard a story about this, and I wonder if you can confirm it for me, that you took the picture of the water damage at the back of the Sphinx, It was covered with some pieces of tape or something.
No,
like this?
Actually, I didn't do that. That was John Anthony West.
Oh, was it?
Yeah,
Is this true?
That was John.
West,
yeah, and the story is true. That he was showing it to myself and other geologists. And when you take a profile of the Sphinx, when you tape off, he would mask off the head and the base, so you couldn't tell where it was. So it just looks like a wall
piece
of
of
rock.
sandstone, yeah.
Yeah, it's a wall of limestone. And you ask the typical geologist who knows about such things, because there's many subfields in geology, well, what kind of weathering is this? And sure, it looks like weathering from rain, from water runoff, that type of thing, because you see a rolling, undulating profile. You see typical fissures where the water runs down through cracks. I mean, it's very clear. It's very different than wind scouring.
Yes, it's quite profound, isn't it, when you see it?
Wind tunnel features, and you don't get the vertical fissures. So he would show this to various geologists as he tells his story. One at Oxford in particular, who was, I guess, very famous. This was before he got me involved. And, he did essentially the same thing to me, too. And then get their answer, oh, it's water weathering without doubt, or something to that effect. Then take off the tape, and you've got the Sphinx.
Everyone's like, what?
Exactly.
Well, let's break for dinner. I need to think about this.
Yes, exactly, because the implications are
huge,
profound and huge.
Yeah.
And I gotta say, there are, I guess, other geologists out there that were maybe approached by John Anthony West before he got me involved, who just based on that little bit of evidence, just from looking at some photographs and whatnot, they probably saw the implications and were a little smarter than me from a pragmatic point of view, that they knew if they got involved in this, it could be, how should I say, it could affect their own personal life,
maybe
because of the
damaging for their career or
controversies,
something.
that type of thing.
Yeah.
And I was a little naive, perhaps, at the time, because I was young. I had not just come out of graduate school, but I was still a young faculty member, only a few years into teaching and being a faculty member. I was at Boston University. I'm still at Boston University. I've been there for my entire professorial career. But I was naive, and I didn't anticipate all the controversy at the level. Controversy is fine, but when it comes down to personal attacks and name calling and people trying to get you fired and that type of thing, if I had really realized how serious that could be, maybe I would have hesitated too. And it's not necessarily lying to it just might be, at least my colleagues, and I don't know their names, but he approached, might have just said, well, no, I've got other things to worry about. I've got other projects to do. But I'm sure it may have been that they realized the implications and how nasty it could get.
See, no, I'm so glad you did this, because you put your head above the parapet. And you went and took it on the chin, really, when many people probably would have shied away. Probably would have been scared of the repercussions of such things. But ultimately, a lot of great discoveries are never made without somebody having a belief and having an idea and sticking to that belief and idea.
Absolutely, absolutely. I hate to bring this up, and this is not egotistical at all, it's just factual. Some people have compared me to Galileo, but the problem with that comparison is, from my point of view, look at the end of his life. He was under house arrest.
He was, calling it heliocentric.
At least they didn't burn him at the stake, but he was under house arrest. Now, is that the type of comparison I want?
It's true. Well, you're certainly not a house arrest. You're here at Contact in the Desert with us. So there are people out there who receive this information, who are happy that you went and did what you did. And I think exactly the same with Robert Bauval as well. He did something that nobody else had really done before regarding this.
But the difference between Robert Bauval and myself, and you've got to understand, Robert Bauval's a close friend, a good friend. I mean, how could he not be? We just did a book together, etc. And I've known him for decades. But he's not in academia.
Yes.
He doesn't have this
PhD.
PhD. I'm not saying this in a nasty way. He doesn't have the PhD. He doesn't have, he doesn't teach for a living, which I do. He's not in a university setting day in and day out. He doesn't, he has that advantage or disadvantage, whichever way you want to say it. This is the problem with John Anthony West, from my point of view. John Anthony West is not an academic, and when we were in the midst of this, when it was really, well, I guess it's still controversial in some people's opinions, but not all. A lot of academics now are accepting it. It's just Egyptologists seem to be the last holdout. But you know, he would laugh and joke about how the academics are attacking us and, you know, calling us names in print and calling me a pseudoscientist. And he'd say, well, what do you care? Well, of course I care, because I have to live in this environment. I am an academic myself. He wasn't. He's an independent writer, independent research. Robert Bauval's an independent researcher and writer. I have to live in that environment.
Yeah, you have a career in that.
You know, so it's a little different when you're right there. And, you know, you go to a Christmas party, which I don't go to anymore, I guess, on the campus, and someone comes up and essentially, you know, has very, very nasty things to say to you, and is, you know, right in your face and intimidate you to the point where you're feeling their saliva hitting your face.
Robert,
I mean, I've experienced this type of thing.
I can imagine. Robert, I'm glad that you stood above the parapet. I'm glad that you had that bravery. I'm glad that you were the diligent, hard-working researcher and geologist that you are, because you've brought us an incredible piece of information, and one that will probably last the test of time just as much as the Sphinx has. Buddy, thanks very much for speaking to us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Really interesting, and I love the work as well that both you and Robert Bauval do on this sort of stuff. Stay tuned, and we'll bring you more of great people like Robert Schoch. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you.
Great stuff. Asylum. Hello and welcome to heaventoearth.com. It's me, Gunnar. I'm joined by a very special guest today, Mr. Andrew Collins. How are you, Andrew?
Yes,
looking dapper in the desert today.
Thank you very much, sir.
What are you doing here, my friend?
I'm here to talk about an alien megastructure, so-called, that's been discovered around a star called KIC 8462852.
I love how you know the name. Well, I tend to call it Steve, but it's commonly known as Tabby's star, isn't it?
It is. It's known as Tabby's star or Boyajian star, after the astronomer who first wrote about the subject in 2015, whose name is Tabitha Boyajian.
Yes.
And essentially, she suggested back then that that something was going in front of this star. It was something which was being recorded by the Kepler Space Telescope.
Now, the Kepler Space Telescope looks at the dimming of stars. And
it does.
And this is how it works out the transits of, let's say, planets that go in front of it. Yeah. Now, this thing has been, dimming consistently for about 100 years, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. But what was noticed before they realised the dimming was that periodically it was dipping its so-called flux or light by anything between 17 and 22%. Now this is completely unknown and mysterious, because the star itself is what they call a main sequence star. It's a normal star, a little bit like our sun, and they shouldn't be doing this. There should be nothing getting in the way of it. You know, anything like planetary debris. You know, if it was a young star, a load of stuff would be going around, coalescing and becoming new planets. Well, it's too old for that, so it's not that.
So it's not a protoplanetary disk we're looking at then?
No, it's not. And the other important thing is that if a planet does go in front of a star and you're observing this transit, as they call it, or this dip in flux, it would only go down a maximum, if it was something like a Jupiter star, you know, size planet, would only go down by about a maximum of 1%.
Wow. And then it'd go back up again once the transit had passed as well?
It does go back up, indeed. But of course, it's the recognition of these light flux dips that tell us that the planets are there. But this is 17% on one occasion, then again 22%. But this all happened in 2011 and 2013. And by the time they'd worked out that something really special was going around there, the Kepler mission had finished, or the first phase. The telescope was facing another direction now, so they couldn't go back, because they started to realise there was a periodicity, some kind of cycle in what was going on, and that it was there in 2011, 2013. What was going to happen in 2015? But it was too late. They couldn't look. It was just too late for them. So they've been waiting for now, because they predicted that something else would happen around now, that this weekend at Contact to the Desert.
So it's happening right now.
And sure enough, on cue,
yes,
the light starts to dip and it's shooting down. As I speak to you now, it had reached 3% and it was dropping so fast that it's quite clear that it's going to go down to 10%, maybe even 20% within the next few days. So whatever it is happening again, and that's really exciting. And the reason I say that is because although there are some natural explanations for this, I mean, it's been suggested it's a swarm of comets. It's a planet a star that's eaten a planet and just burping, and it's just sort of going back to normal. Lots of other weird things, something just getting in the way between here and the star. All of these theories will be thrown out once we get more information. And the grooviest, coolest solution is that this is an alien megastructure.
Wow.
And of course, you've got to then say, well, what is a megastructure?
So, I mean, let's say we're talking about the Kardashev scale here, isn't it?
Yes.
And a Type 1 civilization would have a control over all of its energy on its planet, all of its resources on the planet. But a Type 2 civilization would harness the power within the solar system, or particularly the star. So there's this idea of a Dyson sphere, isn't there?
Yes,
basically, that there's collecting energy from around the sun.
Yeah.
And this is what could lead to this dimming, this pronounced and very
That's
strong
absolutely
dimming.
it. And adding into this is the fact that, as you mentioned earlier, that a astronomer by the name of Bradley Schaefer looked at photographs of that area of the sky that have been recorded every year over the last 110 years. He examined this star very, very closely and realised that it was consistently dimming, and it dimmed for, I can't remember exactly how much it was, but it's sort of more than 10%. And that, you know, this was between something like 1890 and about 1989, I believe. And then that particular series stopped. But then two other astronomers thought, well, hold on, shouldn't we be able to use the Kepler data to see if that same trend continued during the time that Kepler was looking in that area of sky? Sure enough, these astronomers, Ben Montet and Joshua Simon, found that the star was dimmed across that period of about 4 years by 3%. That's an extra 3% to the other dimming that had taken place. At this rate, give it a few hundred years, that star's not going to be there. So what the hell is happening up there?
Because this is what gets me, and I postulated this on the radio show that I do. Are we witnessing something that we've never seen a star do before? Is it going through its final phases? Is it fluctuating in terms of the light that it's emitting? Or are we dealing with something much more mystical, much more strange in terms
firstly,
of this megastructure?
Everything that we've seen so far is to do with visible light. And it's something that can be shown on graphs and spectrograms and things like that. The problem is that, firstly, none of the so-called spectra, which is the pictures that have been taken of Tabby's star during the period of activity, suggest that there are large amounts of what they call infrared excess coming from it. Now, the importance of that is that if you do something and a lot of energy is going on, and maybe you're drawing off this power from no matter how much you contain it, and I mean, in many ways you could perceive it as like a solar panel. A solar panel draws in the energy of the sun, it stores it, you can then channel it away as electricity. A megastructure ultimately is one of these, but on a massive scale. But you can't contain all of that heat. Some of it will be radiated out as on the infrared radar, just like a thermal camera. You use of a thermal camera, you say, oh look, red means it's hot. Same thing, but on a bigger scale. They can't see that yet. And that's not because it's not necessarily there, but they just haven't had enough time to train the correct telescopes in that direction when something is actually happening. But it's more than this, because what happens if you visually look at it? In other words, just through a telescope. I mean, you can blow up, you can see that star, and you see what they call the spectra. The spectra will be in different colours. That means just the pretty colours that come from it, ultimately. This will tell you whether there's an infrared excess. It will tell you whether there are other things happening on other frequencies. If there is no spectra, it's just plainly white, as it were, that means that something's very cold and maybe solid. So that's what's happening at the moment. And as we speak here now, Scientific American, just its latest press release today, says that half of the big telescopes in the world are looking at this star now, this moment. and that's so credible, I think. You know, I mean, you've got SETI looking at it, you've got all these big, huge arrays in you know, all the way around the world. You've got visual observation, you've got X-ray platforms, you know, that have all been turned towards it to look at the X-ray excess coming from it. This is a big news story.
Huge news story.
And most people here don't know about it, and this is our best chance. And more than this, just this week, the BBC, the conservative BBC in the UK, put on a documentary that was essentially all about this star and said it's our best opportunity to confirm the existence of alien civilizations. So why aren't more people talking about this?
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad you're here to talk to us today about it. So I'm guessing with all of these telescopes that are pointing at this star at this moment, we could probably begin to rule in or out whether it's a fluctuation in the star's energy or whether it's actually something much more strange, like say an alien megastructure, couldn't we?
Indeed, yeah. And I mean, you know, even if it is alien, there's going to be different possibilities of what's going on up there. I mean, clearly we're looking at it from a very sort of terracentric, material point of view. You know, the idea, as you say, that, you know, the
Kardashev
that, I can't say that word properly. You know, the different types of civilizations, which are probably real, but you know, the idea that whatever it is going to be just taking energy, or perhaps taking mass from the actual star itself. That's a process known as star lifting.
Okay.
And if any of your viewers want to know more about that, there's a very, very good YouTube video all about the star lifting process, how it would work, you know, the different reasons you would do it. And basically what this means is they're sucking up the actual mass from it, and that might be hydrogen, which is obviously the primary source of a star. Secondary source is helium. And there are many other what they call rare metals, which would also be useful to take away and use, you know, on somebody's home planet, for instance.
So that would have to be on an unimaginable scale, wouldn't it, to actually take these elements out of a star and then to use them, these like say hydrogen, helium, this sort of stuff, and the rare metals.
Well, apparently it's not that difficult. Really? No, and I mean. You know, there have been a number of theories that have already been put forward on how it could be done, even by ourselves, if it ever came to that. So no, actually, it's not that difficult. You know, it seems like it should be, but it's not. I mean, I'm not even going to try and go into how you could do it.
But once the technology is there, it's possible.
Yeah,
you know?
and you know, there's a lot of theoretical physicists and theoretical engineers who are looking at these sort of ideas to do with star lifting, the so-called Dyson sphere or Dyson swarms, Dyson, you know, series, and even recently the Dyson rings. Yeah. Right. Did you want to take that one?
We'll cut that. We'll cut that out.
Oh, okay. Right. I'll say about the theories again. I mean, you know, there are many different theories of what could be. Sorry, okay. I mean, as to what's going on, I mean, there are many different theoretical physicists and engineers who are looking at these ideas now and seeing how we, as a species, could actually do this, perhaps with our own sun or a neighbouring sun. And of course, it's theoretical, but who knows what might be happening in 100 years' time. But then we get on to the more esoteric side of Tabby's star, because what I have discovered is that there are certain periodicities that have already been noted by Tabitha Boyajian and others in connection with the star, and these are either orbits of the star itself, or they relate to whatever it is that's in orbit around it. So in theory, they should be natural. However, when you look at them, they produce certain key numbers. Key numbers that are important to mathematical formula. Key numbers that are important to mathematical formula that we know here on Earth and have done for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We're talking, for instance, about Pascal's triangle, which is a way of creating very easily the Fibonacci sequence, which obviously is the fundamental structure of nature itself, of the growth of life within nature. But also it can be used for probability solving, it can be used for predictions, it can be used in many different ways, which I definitely do not understand, in mathematics. And the significance here is that in 2005 a French astronomer by the name of Luc Arnold said that with all of these space missions going up there, like Kepler, wouldn't this be a great opportunity for an alien intelligence to communicate back with us in what he referred to as attention-seeking signals? And he suggested that these light fluxes could contain information to do with prime numbers, binary, or even produce geometrical shapes, which I don't think is probably quite right, because it's not as easy as that as far as the interpretation of these light dips. Well, here we have that. We've actually exactly got that. That's exactly what I was presenting in my lecture. But what's so significant is that these same numbers to do with Pascal's triangle crop up in association with the Great Pyramid, in particular the number 121, which is something that my friend and colleague Robert Bouval is here lecturing about, all these strange coincidences of geometry and mathematics in association with the Great Pyramid. And he is coming to the conclusion that this information encoded within the Great Pyramid is not something that simply was known by the architect and just incorporated in for fun. That it's almost like a code that was, you might call, divinely inspired at the time, that was placed there for us to understand thousands and thousands of years later. In other words, it was almost the place that was chosen for this information to be passed down like a time capsule through to the modern age. And only now, with the work of people like Robert, his co-author in his book, Chandra Wickman Singh, and other similar people, and myself. I mean, Robert's mind's work are converging perfectly at this time, and he believes that this information may be of alien origin. I think there's a good chance that that's the case as well.
Yeah. So Robert's talking along with Chandra that this like you say, a time capsule's been left here by whoever to unlock us to the mysteries of the universe, to explain our origins and who we are. And maybe now we're hitting a civilizational peak, let's say, or a technological peak, whereby, as you were saying, these guys are perhaps thinking, we can contact them now, we can get in touch with them. Is this what you think might be taking place?
It is, but of course there is a huge problem. And that's the fact that Tabis star is 1,300 light years away from here. Now let's put this into perspective. Not only is that a long way away, but if you send, if let's say we confirm that this is an alien megastructure, and let's say that they are sending out some kind of broadcast, if we tried to respond to this, they'd receive the message 1,300 light years from now. Well, 1,300 years, not light years. Although I think what's important here is to say that nothing, in theory, travels faster than light. I mean, not conventionally, not within physics, conventional physics at least, anyway. And of course, if they wanted to respond back to our hi, we've got your message, it's going to take another 1,300 years. So we're talking about 2,600 years round journeys here. So there's got to be a way of shortcutting this. And the answer is very simple: quantum entanglement.
Yes, absolutely.
Quantum entanglement is something which is at the fundamental root of a lot of weirdness within the quantum world, which is the subatomic world that exists beyond our physical universe. And in simple terms, this can be looked at in this way. That's that every particle has a twin. Don't ask me why, it has a twin. And those twins part, and even if they went to the furthest ends of the universe, if you tweaked one, the other one responds instantaneously.
One's up, the other one's down.
Yes.
Instantaneously. Faster than light as well.
Yeah. Well, it's not just faster than light, it's in theory, from our perspective, instantaneous. Now, that's one particle. If you can imagine that we have not just trillions and trillions and trillions of particles within ourselves and within the environment around us, but if you can imagine that all these seas of particles are dancing the same dance within, say, my head, at least some of their twins could be in your head dancing the same dance. And if they are, then that's what we'd call telepathy. And that's instantaneous. But of course that opens up the possibility of things like remote viewing, the idea of seeing things afar, maybe through somebody else's eyes or through somebody, a memory stored from the past, or the future. Experiments have been done. Well, hold on, we're getting too far ahead of ourselves here, because the other important point, there's two things. Firstly, entanglement relates to consciousness.
Yes.
Because if you observe these experiments that are done with particles, it changes the outcome.
This is like the
split.
dual wave sort of particle split, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, essentially, without going into it in any detail, because nobody really understands what the hell's going on, is that that a particle can be a wave, in other words, an energy, until it's observed, and once it's observed, it becomes fixed as a particle and changes the outcome of an experiment.
This is it. This is the wave of probability that exists before you actually observe it. The
Like
moment you observe
Schrodinger's
it,
cat
it
whole concept.
condenses and it becomes a particle in a particular.
It does, and so what this means, forget why, because nobody really understands. What this means is that consciousness has an effect upon particles existing in a subatomic world. There is no time. I mean, time is essentially something of artificial construction. I mean, that doesn't mean that there's not cycles or loops of activity, but that's not time as in the passage of time that we see on a clock moving around from midnight to midnight, etc., etc. We count, but we are an intelligent species that likes to count for some reason, and that's important to us. That doesn't happen on a subatomic level. So essentially, when these twin particles go off in different directions, there's no reason at all why one of them could not go off into the future and the other one could not go off into the past. And what this means is that telepathy can occur not just on the here and now, the present, but also in the future and in the past. And that means that some aspect of us could influence the past can influence us, the future can influence us. In other words, we can almost draw on the future for information, whether it be to do with our own personal lives, connected with our own personal selves, or perhaps picking up information to do with future technologies and science and things like that, get insights into the future. And I mean, this might sound like very, new agey, but there have been a number of experiments done by universities to show that the future can influence the past. I mean, for instance, they've set up experiments where people have tried to connect remote view and change instrumentation that's planted somewhere that nobody's actually looking at, but they're deliberately doing it in the past. In other words, that the experiment is like done partly in the past, partly in a future situation. They're trying to change the readings of instrumentation. Nobody's looking at it. Nobody's looking at it at all. And then when obviously they go to that box and they look at it, sure enough, it's all changed. Now, all right, there's pedantics could come into it and say, well, you might be thinking you're influencing the past, but maybe you're influencing the present. But quite clearly, these are time logged as well. So you say, no, actually, look, the time log suggests all these changes occurred, actually at this time, the time that we were mentally focusing on. And these are scientific experiments that have been written up as reports and papers that you can find online.
Absolutely. So, as we're talking about this then, and if it is a alien race that is some way trying to make contact with us, surely they wouldn't need to show us via the star. If we're all quantumly entangled, is there not, and this consciousness is fundamental, is it not possible that they can, I guess they're preparing us for that conscious connection, that instantaneous consciousness?
Yes,
quantumly
absolutely.
Connection.
But going back to the Tabby star, the answer to the communication is quantum entanglement. Now, whether we do that through our mind or through some other process remains to be seen. At the moment, the most obvious thing is to connect with them through the mind and say, we are here, yes, we've got your message, give us another sign. Now, all right, in theory, in the physical universe, if they give us a sign, it's going to take 1300 years for that to kick in. But here's the good thing, because of entanglement working across time, what that tells us is that they could send a message not just to the present day, but also the past, any point in the past. So they could have influenced the mind of the architect of the Great Pyramid to encode that response.
Could they have encoded the response within Tabby's star 1300 years ago so we pick it up now at the right time?
But why 1300 years ago? Because, I mean, 1300 years ago we were in the Dark Ages, certainly in Britain. Obviously the Maya civilization was at its height. I mean, obviously there were various other civilizations around, you know, Indian, Vedic civilizations, China, etc., etc. But I mean, maybe we should look closer at what was going on 1300 years ago. And I think that's probably a good thing to look at. But all of these things tell us that something big is going on. Now, okay, it could well be that with all these telescopes looking at Tabby's star right now, they could come back and say, mystery solved, and we can scrub this interview and go on with our lives and do something else, which is what I do generally anyway, talking about ancient civilizations. But I have a feeling that this is going to build and build, because with so many telescopes and so many minds focused on one spot in the sky in a manner which has never ever been done before, that tells us something. And it also gives the opportunity for an alien intelligence to use this to their advantage.
Do you think now is the time? Do you think we're ready? Do you think this is what's going to take place in the next sort of 50 years maybe?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
so we're on the precipice of one of the most amazing periods of human history.
Absolutely.
If this is the case.
But this, through entanglement, this works through mass consciousness. The more people that know about this, the more likely it is to happen.
So this is important.
This is crucial to the future of humanity. As Mikko Kaku said, you know, the well-known physicist, I mean, he said that the discovery of Tabby's star was the most important discovery in the last 500 years since the discovery by Columbus of the Americas. That's what he said. And we're going to have to rewrite all of our books to accommodate this discovery. That's what he said in October 2015 when all this was first announced.
So truly on the precipice of a brave new world.
I'd like to think so.
Andrew Collins, thanks very much for speaking to us, my friend. That was absolutely fascinating. We'll see what happens here in the future, I guess, and if this is the moment where finally contact happens, and maybe contact in the desert for us as well. That's an incredible story as well. Thanks for speaking to us, my friend.
My pleasure.
You can hear more interviews like this on heaventoearth.com, of course. Stay tuned, we'll bring you some more fantastic interviews.